Thanks, y'all. Jalen said he was going to begin his heckling early. I'm appreciative of that. Let's all be true to who we are. And so thank you all for this opportunity and this possibility. Let's just take a moment to kind of enter quietly into this space, just a moment in silence. And welcome. So this is the part where the preacher preaches. And I'm going to tell you today, this is the part where I invite you into my wrestling. This is not a sermon that I can preach. And I don't really see myself as a preacher. I see myself more as a ranter. Maybe if a soapbox is handy in class every now and then, I'll climb up for 3 to 15 minutes and just let it go. And I think students appreciate that because it gets us away from the material they were supposed to have read for that particular class period. But in this case, the text from the lectionary, which I said yes to, I don't want to act in any way except that I said yes to it, is one that I find highly problematic. And I'm going to do what my preaching professor said I ought not do. I'm sorry, Dr. O'Day. You'll be fine. And that's to preach both with, but primarily against the text. Because this text in and of itself is, in my hearing, and in the places that I have heard it preached, hundreds of times it seems like, is always preached through a triumphalist lens. The people gathered in that place are the ones that are held in the favor of the vineyard keeper and the vine. And those who are outside the favor of that community are the branches that will be cut and thrown away. Now, my own journey around not just this text, but the biblical texts in particular, I kept finding my best teachers and the people that I loved the most to be in community with to be the branches who are often tossed away. Those who named by the reader of the text and the interpreters of the text as the people who were not fit to stand within the love of God. And were not obviously truly rooted in the vine, the true vine. I disagree with that. And it has not been my experience. But there's a problematic aspect just in the interpretation of that and the way I've heard it preached is so often the preacher, the interpreter of the text, places themselves in full favor in the role of God. They obviously know what the soil is. They obviously know the only source of the true vine is the true vine that is only expressed in that place at that time in that position. And they obviously know all the branches that ought to be tossed. I also want to argue against it a little bit because while it's a metaphor, it is a metaphor that I think comes apart pretty easily. I'm not sure that the writer of John or the quote or Jesus as quoted here, that Jesus is all that good of a farmer. I'm not sure that it's really there in the space that sees all the possibilities for what a vintner could do with that. And that goes back to the poem that Michaelan read so well that shattered me earlier this month as it talks about the resistance of nature to the very people that are called to be stewards in the midst of this. That the space is, and then in the quote, the line that anchors the poem, the line that keeps the poem steady is this idea that we will outlive them. Wir werden sie überleben. And the Jews who made up that resistance song on the spot were Polish, murdered by the SS in Lublin in 1939, ordered to sing to their own execution. And I read that, and I thought of that on a day that I believe this is the song of the Palestinian people in Gaza. We will outlive our oppressors. I believe, as the poet believes, this is the song of the earth in resistance to all the poor stewards of the earth. that we participate in, that this is the song, we will outlive them, the lichen will outlive us. As I sometimes joke with colleagues who are in ecological theology at AAR, I believe we should begin to write our papers in scent so that the roaches and the rats can interpret them, because they will outlive us. Maybe we shouldn't go that far, but the possibilities is the earth will persist. And I believe no matter what we do in this space, life will persist. And the decisions we make are, do we stand alongside and sing the song along with creation, that we will outlive them in solidarity with all the life and abundance that has been brought forth surrounding us? Or will we continue to be standing there as the executioners? So that's how I want to preach against the text. In line with this poet, Erica Meitner, who's an indigenous poet, teaches at the University of Wisconsin. This poem came out in a recent anthology of indigenous poets that I've been reading along, and just kind of shatters it, puts everything in my mind in a different perspective. So I got to be honest, I don't just preach against this text, this vineyard text. I tend to preach against a lot of texts in the Bible because we're not the people in Western culture. We have to read the text as the oppressor and not the oppressed. So in this space, part of what's happening in the poem and is happening in that particular theological text is, how do I align myself again with the branches that are tossed away? And so I dug a little bit more deeply. I amused one of my New Testament colleagues when I mentioned who I was going to quote from in this sermon, because I believe that this may be the only point of agreement I would find with the biblical scholar Scott McKnight. By far. But McKnight, you all would have been to some exposure. Depends on the type of church you grew up in. I would have been exposed to this person too. But McKnight reads that text, that those who abide in me, that you are already trimmed to the word. He trims any branch that produces fruits, will produce even more fruit. And that he removes any of the branches that don't produce fruit. McKnight, that word, that Greek word called erai, or I happily mispronounce the Greek. That's part of my charm. But McKnight says that this particular word is interpreted in different ways and translated in different ways throughout the text. That very often it means lifted up. So to think about that God lifts up any of the branches that don't produce fruit as opposed to chops them off, gives a pretty different interpretation of what's happening in this text. And one that I think finds itself with, we will outlive them. We will stand forward, and offers the possibility of renewal of a church that seeks purity as opposed to obedience towards a gospel message of life for all who are oppressed under the thumb of our culture, the thumb of our churches, all the ways that we produce oppression in our spaces. So we will outlive them. But I still think the writer of the biblical text is not that good of a farmer. Because if you are one of those folks who has been named as a branch to be removed because of sexuality, because of race, because of abilities, or abilities that aren't recognized within our culture, maybe a good vineyard keeper, a good vintner, would take the branch that has been cut off and root it into new stock to offer the possibility of radical new growth. So the church that I get excited about, the vine and the branches that I think hold the most possibility, are actually the very branches that have been thrown away. The people and the places that have been told they are not worthy to stand in the place where the love of God exists and are asked to be moved outside of the community, are those branches that have been thrown away And those are the very stock that might be the place of new growth and new life and new possibility. And if that's the case, the branches that are thrown up and dry up, these branches are not gathered up and thrown into fire and burned. Those branches become the space of possibility, new life, new wine, new hope, and even new wineskins. And I believe that is what is the possible glorification of God. That a branch that has been called not worthy, a space that has been called not producing the fruit that is recognized within the culture of a church that only recognizes certain fruits, might actually be the source of life for all to go forward. And on this Earth Day, that's one of the only spaces I can find words of hope. It is an incredibly challenging space to be if you work in and around ecology right now. It is an incredibly challenging place to be if you pay any attention to the world around us. As a scientist recently said, if you're in a place that's called wild and you look outside your tent flap or your camper or however you got there, you're seeing 1/3 to 2/3 less life than someone would have seen 50 years ago. It's erased. It's all gone. And that life, I believe we have to seek to reroot. So as I read this text and as I read this poem, I think the call of who we are to be on this Earth Day is not those who find ourselves comfortable in the favor of a God who prunes, but alongside and in creative alliance with a God who reroots, who grafts, who brings new fruit and new possibility for a world that is just beginning to come into being. There is nothing we know today, or very little we know today, that can influence how we're to live in the next 10 years. We are in a time of radical and significant change. And we are in a time where the things that we can retrieve from what has gone before have got to be grafted and rerouted into spaces that allow life to go forward in radically new ways. So I ask for this group to join with me in maybe making new wine. A few of y'all who are willing, I'll drink the wine with you too. But can we continue to be a people who reimagine how the Word and life of God might come to fruition in our space and in our time in radical and different ways, and be a place that gathers all those who know themselves to have been thrown away or given up on or called without fruit or without favor. Can we be a place that allows people to come, spend time, find new roots, new possibility, and then go forth into a world bearing fruit for new life and new possibility? That's all I can commit to today. Thank you all. Amen.